So I wanted to do a video on this UCDavis DNA study that some content creators seem to think is a huge boom and that will be in favor of Koberger and the defense, but I don't believe it is. What it is the lab manager at UCDavis did his thesis on DNA, primary and secondary transfer, and he used a knife sheath snap as one part of it, and then also a pole with transfer of touching like a pole and then a drug baggie. But we're going to focus on what he found from touching a knife sheath. And he did tests with like hands that were like not real hands, like fake hands. Well, one was like people wearing gloves and then you put the DNA on there. And then the other was like a fake hand that you put DNA on. And then the other was actual people's hands after they'd washed their hands and then touched. And he did like direct touch. So where you touch the snap on the knife sheath with the wild, which was the hands with no gloves or anything, then a gloved hand, then like a fake hand. And then you also did handshakes and then touched the snap after the handshake. So the person shaking hands. And he looked at also what males and females left behind as well, because when you talk about DNA being left behind, especially skin cells, there's shedder status and all those things. But I'll link his study into the comment section. I'm not going to go through his whole study, but I just wanted to hit on the couple points that I think are big and actually in favor of Rylene Nowlin and what the prosecution has been saying. So if you recall, Rylene Nowlin has stated that she believes that it was direct transfer. Brian Koberger's skin cells on the snap. And she believes you can differentiate between indirect and direct based on the amount of cellular material that has been left. And that has been a big controversy because there's several scientists that don't believe that you can, but there are scientists that also believe that you can tell based on the amount of skin cells. Well, this guy's study actually shows that you can differentiate. I highlighted the paragraph where it talks about that, and it says the result indicated that the relative DNA recovery on surfaces of interest, such as the snap button and the drug baggie, after secondary transfer ranged from only 6 to 23% of the total DNA recovered from the same surfaces after primary transfer. Overall, this study distinguishes between direct and indirect transfer based on recovery values and final surface, which can be used to support accurate event reconstruction and evidence interpretation. So yes, he's actually saying that you can determine from the recovery values off the surface event reconstruction, in interpretation, meaning whether you think it's primary or secondary and how it got on there. That's backs up what Rylene Nowlin has been saying. But let's look at the values that he found from the different types of transfer. Okay, so this would be primary pathway. So this would be a domesticated hand directly touching the snap. So no handshake, nothing, just directly touching it. And it's the hand that had the glove on, and then DNA was put onto that glove. And you can see you have the total DNA, and that's in the nanograms, and you have the mean, the standard deviation, and the range. And the DNA that was on the domesticated hand, and then what was left on the snap button. And you'll see that range was 0.02 to 1.94 nanograms. Standard deviation was 0.45 nanograms, so plus or minus either way it could be. And then the mean was 0.60. Now keep in mind, what was referenced in the documents for Koberger was 0.168 nanograms per UL, which was the elution solution. So we know that what was found on the SNAP was actually more than 0.168 nanograms, because that 0.168 was the amount after it was diluted in the solution. But we're going to go on and look at the next table. So this one was secondary pathway. So this was indirect touch. So it was when you had the domesticated hand shake hands with the mock hand and then touch the SNAP. And domesticated hand, you can see the DNA they had on there, the mean, and then the standard deviation, and then the range. And you can see that what is left on the SNAP button from secondary transfer is less than what's on there from primary transfer, of course. Standard deviation was 0.15, so not quite the same amount of deviation, actually less deviation, but that's also because it's a smaller amount being left on there. But it's 0.03 to 0.54. So you can see that's a very tiny amount of nanograms. The mean was 0.197. But Lana was looking at this in particular and looking at like this 0.197 mean and then going, well, the Koberger was 0.168. But again, this is just nanograms, and the Koberger one was the nanograms per UL. So that was in the microliters of the elution solution. So you can't compare them directly like that. And I'm going to talk about that after all this. So let's go on to the next table. So this third one was when you had what was called the wild fingerprint. That was a bare hand. So no glove on it and not the fake hand. This was a real hand, a bare hand, after the person had washed their hands. And primary pathway, which means it was the direct touch. So they directly touched the SNAP. This would most be like Koberger touching that SNAP, unsnapping that SNAP. And the mean was 0.51 nanograms. The standard deviation was 0.46. So you can see I have a little bit bigger standard deviation again. And then the range was 0.04 to 1.8. So you can see right there, those values are larger, obviously, because it is direct touch. So let's look at all three in comparison. So the top one is the primary. So that would be touching it directly with regular fingers, no gloves, with DNA put on there in the lab. The second one was primary with the domesticated hand, which was the one that had the glove on it, and then they put DNA on the glove. And then the last one was the indirect transfer. So the secondary pathway after like the person wearing gloves shook hand with the mock hand. And you'll notice that what had the largest amount of primary was actually the domesticated hand where they put the DNA on there. But that's also likely because they put a set amount of DNA on that hand. And whereas when you have a natural hand, you're going to have different shedder status. And males and females also shed differently, they found. But the largest deposits of DNA you could see were on the direct touch, which is what you would expect. The indirect leaves behind less DNA. Now, the only thing we know so far, because we have not seen all the lab reports, was just what came out in some of the documents for motions in limine, and that was that what was on the SNAP was 0.168 nanograms UL. Now, that is not the amount of nanograms that was actually on the sheath. That 0.168 you cannot translate directly to 0.168 nanograms because this is nanograms /UL, which is microliters, which is the elution solution that they used. But I'm going to show you how we can try to get a ballpark figure of what the amount on the sheath could have been. Now, as I talked about in the past in some of my community posts, it all depends on the amount of solution that was used. And because we don't know for sure the amount of solution, I'm going to go by what's typically used. So for STR profiles, that's your short tandem repeat, they typically use 30 to 100 microliters of the elution solution. So if they use 30, which is the minimum of the typical. If 30 microliters was used, then the minimum amount of DNA that was on that snap was 5.04 nanograms. Now, you look at that compared to that study, that is definitely direct transfer amount. That is not indirect transfer amount. And this is why Rylene Nowlin is saying she believes it's direct touch, that he touched it. Now, there are common DNA extraction kits that are used at the labs. You can see the Cleogen normally uses 50 microliters. Promega uses 50 to 100, and Chalex uses 100. So the more volume of elution solution, the higher the amount of DNA would have been on that snap. So, for instance, if only 10 microliters were used, that's 1.68 nanograms that was on the snap. But we know at least a minimum of 30. Well, we don't know for sure, but typically a minimum of 30 would be used to do an STR profile. So that's going to put that at around 5 nanograms. Folks, that is not secondary transfer. If that turns out to be truly what that 0.168 nanograms, in microliters turns out to be, Rylene Nowlin is correct in her assumption that it's direct transfer and not touch. Because it would be hard to get that amount just from shaking hands with someone. And we'll look again at those tables that were found in that study. So if you look at direct touch on a hand that didn't have a glove with DNA added to it, that range was 0.04 to 1.8. And the mean was 0.51. What was found on that snap was way over that, if the assumptions about the solution are correct. That also means it wasn't just a one-time touch. That likely means he opened that snap more than once, so more skin cells sloughed off every time he touched it. The other thing is direct pressure does cause more skin cells to come off as well. So putting pressure on something like a snap can cause more to come off. So even if he just opened it once, more could have sloughed off than normal. And if he's a higher shedder. But males leave behind less than females. So it could just be he is a higher shedder among males. But once we find out what the solution amount was, how many microliters, that's going to make a difference in determining how much was actually on that sheath. Or they may actually release the documents soon, hopefully, that show how much was on that sheath. But there's a reason why Rylene Nowlin believes it's direct transfer, and it's not because she is trying to just pull the wool over anyone's eyes. A 0.168 nanograms in a solution is always going to be more than that 0.168 because that solution always dilutes it down. So even if they used like a minimum of 10, that's still going to be over 1 nanogram of skin cells that was on that sheath. So, and I've talked about that before. And you know what? You can believe me. You don't have to believe me. Right now, this is all speculation, though, because we don't know how much solution there was. But this guy's study just backs up that they can recreate how the skin cells got on there, whether it was direct touch or indirect. So scientific community is going to have to start coming around on this because the amount of skin cells left is very indicative of direct or indirect touch, and this study shows it.